Okay. I want to move on then a little bit further forward in time. After David Cameron's resignation, you were very quick. I mean, from my reading, in the first 6 MPs in the door to support Theresa May's leadership campaign. What was it about Theresa May that you identified at that time as somebody who should be, could be, leader of the Conservative Party and Prime Minister?
I think that Theresa May had done a very good job, in as Home Secretary. Obviously, as with all these positions, not always perfect, but had been very good. She was a woman, and I think that was, I'm always very keen to actively support female candidates and female leaders, and she was very strong. She was very modest. I think just her approach to kind of public service, dedicated approach both to her constituency and to the roles that she'd done. She'd obviously done, as well as being Home Secretary, a whole range of roles within the Conservative Party. I thought she, was a good candidate.
You didn't at that time support Boris Johnson's campaign, although then you did, later on, further down the road, swing in behind Johnson. Looking back, do you think that it would have been better if you had supported Johnson's campaign at that stage? Would that have, taken a period of time away in which, more could have been done? Or do you think that the way in which the last couple of years has developed has been, on the large, beneficial?
Well, I certainly don't think that the way the Brexit process, I talk about the process, not necessarily the decision. You know which way I voted at the referendum, but I also felt it was important to honour that referendum decision, having posed the question. I do think the way the political system in the UK has executed that, we have had a huge loss of time, and that does concern me. So whether Boris Johnson coming in earlier might have, having led the Brexit campaign, having moved forward with that, whether that would have accelerated and reduced that opportunity cost of the last few years, I don't know. But what I do think it comes out and will come out more is that what Theresa May was trying to achieve, probably as her premiership went on, was a deal which both was focused on protecting the United Kingdom and also on reducing what's called friction, but in fact, are reasonably high costs to business of the Brexit process. So I think that she was trying to get something which was, a good compromise, which obviously ultimately didn't make it through the Commons. And you can argue again, takes you back to, would it have been better to have a different approach from day one? But I think I was always going to want to give a more compromising approach a go, because I felt that was the right thing to do.
Mm-hmm. Well, so no regrets over supporting Theresa May's campaign. Okay. Then in 2017, you were appointed Deputy Chief Whip under Gavin Williamson, and you were actually Chief Whip less than 6 months later after Williamson was appointed to Defence Secretary. I would say that you and Gavin Williamson, are quite different personalities in many ways. I'll give you an example. Williamson, and many people listening may know this, kept a pet tarantula on his desk called Cronus, as I understand it, which is, I think, objectively a little strange. And it sounds like a stupid question to ask, but is the job of Chief Whip really as shady as that tarantula or House of Cards, for example, might make it out to be?
Well, I think it has modernised a huge amount, and I, within the first couple of weeks of taking on that job, actually ended up dealing with all the Me Too segments to issues, and that was an incredibly full-on period where we were dealing with all sorts of issues, and part of that was making sure that the Whip's office was no longer dealing with complaints, and a proper grievance process was set up for MPs. So I think the dark arts and whatever have broadly gone and left, but it is obviously a role where you are trying to get the government's business through, and certainly, for the period I was there, it was probably the most high-profile period for the Whip's office in British political history. because the numbers after the 2017 election were so wafer thin, and where we obviously had the confidence and supply agreement with the DUP, and people we were literally scrabbling to get votes for possibly the most complex deal that Britain had ever had to take through Parliament.
Yeah, it's interesting you raise in the context of the Whip's office the Me Too movement. Do you, under your time and previously, were processes changed quite quickly in the way that the Whip's office did its work? I mean, I think it's no secret that many people might believe that the Whips keep a black book of all the scandals and affairs and black marks, and that sort of institutional leverage is in the job. Was that the case beforehand, and were there procedures that were put in place to remove that and maybe?
Well, I think there'd already been quite a big modernisation of processes, and but I think just the fact that there was during that period and following that period a formal complaints procedures put in place, I think was helpful. But I think it had modernised. And it was a fascinating job because you obviously had all of the mental health issues, the physical issues, the family issues that any organisation has, but then sort of weaved into that the increasing national focus on these meaningful votes that businesses, citizens wanted to get concluded, so they knew where they stood.
And in doing that work, you took a sort of different approach to Williamson, I think would be fair, maybe more carrot than stick, as opposed to the Tarantula that I've mentioned. I read you kept an array of cakes on display and went for the charm offensive instead. As a general rule in life, Julian, I wonder which of those two approaches do you think is more effective? If you have to give advice to students about how to win friends and influence people, is your approach, which is more maybe subtle and quiet and about persuasion, more effective with cakes, or is the kind of tarantula on the desk approach the better one?
Well, I mean, you can basically get me to do anything if you give me a cake, Thomas. So I'm probably not the best person to ask. But I think, look, you need to be tough. You need to be tough in this business. You need to be tough in other businesses. So I think it would be wrong to say that, particularly any political party, is able to just, its MPs having become MPs on the party ticket, that the party doesn't at some point say, look, guys and girls, you've got to vote with the government and push very hard on that. I don't think that's unreasonable. It's also not unreasonable, by the way, for the MP to, not follow that rule. But I don't, I think that it's not a unreasonable ask. I do think, though, generally you want to make your arguments and persuade people. And but I think the realities of politics are at times you do have to be quite tough.
Yeah. You've mentioned already, and we'll sort of get to it now, you were the chief whip at almost the worst or maybe best possible time, the biggest parliamentary fight in a generation for Theresa May's Brexit deal, pushing that through Parliament. At times, every vote counted, and your job as chief whip to corral often unwilling Tory MPs. I don't really want to get into the kind of minutiae of which vote and when, but I wonder, as a general overview of that period of time in your life, did you sleep at all? Were you constantly angry, frustrated? It must have been the most sort of exhausting process, even on an individual level, before you get into the world of politics.
So it was very full on, and it got very, very stressful. I mean, I was in number 9 Downing Street probably 7 days a week. I had a car on standby throughout the weekend. It was really 24/7. Physically, it was very demanding. I lost a lot of hair. I lost, got into, very unfit, because I think that there was a huge pressure. Essentially, as I said earlier, you were trying to get a very complex deal through Parliament, and you realise that the nation was basically waiting for this to happen. I think also, I found during that period, my business background was obviously trying to get people to find a landing zone, get a solution. And by the way, that was what Theresa May was trying to do. But obviously the political world, where you've got leadership issues within parties, you've got very strong views on the type of Brexit that people wanted. It was more complex. You know, we nearly got there, and I would argue if we'd managed to get you know, an exit mechanism or a date on the backstop from the EU in December 2018, we probably could have made it across the line.
I want to move on in just a second to Northern Ireland, which is all we ever want to talk about. The final thing I want to raise, though, is you made, I suppose, a fairly strong intervention chatting to Laura Kuenssberg in early 2020. And you said two significant things that I'd like to raise and just chat about. One was you said that in the back and forth over May's Brexit deal, that there was a, quote, worst example of ill discipline in cabinet in British political history. My question is that I think as a student myself, young person, we hear a lot of this kind of stuff which says, you know, it's the worst in history, best in history, unprecedented. Were you exaggerating at all when you were talking about how bad the discipline was in cabinet, or is that a fairly honest assessment from you that it's the worst in British political history?
Well, it's obviously for others to judge whether, you know, it is the worst or one of the worst, whatever. But it was a period where, you know, even within cabinet, there were very strong views. That's obviously nothing new. That's you know, John Major talked about his group of people that he, in fairly flowery language, that were causing him problems, and that has been ever thus. But I do think, again, at a point where Britain was going through a period where it needed everybody to be disciplined and get through and basically get this over the line. You know, there was a level of briefing, a level of, you know, talking to journalists, and basically the Prime Minister unable to have confidential conversations with her cabinet, which was not helpful.
Were friendships ruptured over that particular issue for you?
Over which issue?
The ill discipline in cabinet.
Well,
I imagine stern words were past your lips.
There were very stern words. This was a very stressful period for everybody, and I'm sure I and others have regrets on how certain conversations took place.
Okay, say no more. The last thing I want to mention before Northern Ireland is, in the same conversation, you said that after the Conservative Party had failed to get that majority in 2017, that the government as a whole should have been clearer on the consequences of that. That is to say that, you know, the reality should have been made clear that a softer Brexit was going to be inevitable. I wonder, I suppose that's an easy thing to say, Julian, you know, after the case, do you think that it would have been possible to have emphasised that? Do you think it would have been possible to have gone down the route that you suggest for advocating the reality of a softer Brexit without totally sinking May's premiership? Was that an avenue that was really open, or do you think that that was kind of some retrospective reflection?
Well, I think at the time there was quite a lot of effort, almost cross-party, very early on after the referendum, to look at, you know, could there be some landing zone? And then after the election, I think we probably just didn't adapt to the realities of, you know, of the numbers. But I think the thing probably also to remember is, you know, there's a lot of focus on the Conservative Party and the fact that, you know, there were quite a lot of people within the ERG wanting a sort of purer version. And, you know, in a way that was illogical given the numbers. But in fact, they've been proven to have won the day. But, you know, I think Peter Mandelson made a comment this week about the fact that, you know, on the other side, there were many people trying to reverse the result through the second referendum. And that has meant that actually, and he admits this has meant that a softer Brexit was lost. And I do think that, you know, when you look back, and I think historians will look back at this period, you know, they will look at a Conservative Party that was pretty fractured, and I was also trying to hold together. But they will also look at a Labour Party and a Liberal Party and others who had a chance to vote for a deal 18 months ago that was, you know, fairly balanced and, you know, a compromise deal, and chose not to.